many of you have ever been tempted to follow plan B just in case plan A doesn't really work out well? Right? Okay, yeah. All of us have, myself included. So let's be honest. We like to have plans B through Z as a safety net. We are people that really like to have a safety net, a backup plan, something to fall back on if faith just feels maybe a little too risky, or if things just feel like maybe we're not following, or maybe this isn't going the way that we want it to go. And so we always have these backup plans. But here's the truth. We've been talking about ridiculous faith over the last few weeks. And ridiculous faith doesn't leave room for a plan B. And that's a really hard thing to come in grips with, because we are a people who love to have multiple options. Multiple options. But the truth is, ridiculous faith doesn't leave room for a plan B. And so after Andy became a believer, and we were friends for a long while before we started dating, and after he became a believer, we used to send sermons and podcasts and readings and stuff back and forth. And during this particular time, I can remember that Andy and I were facing some pretty difficult decisions individually in our lives, and there were some really challenging things. And this was long before I became a pastor, but one of the things that both Mickey and Andy have in common that most pastor spouses don't have in common are that they became pastor spouses after the wedding. So most of the time, a person who marries a pastor knows they're marrying a pastor before they get into that. And so here's Andy and Mickey, who all of a sudden after the wedding hear their spouses come to them and say, here's our plan A. After the fact. And you see, many people know this ahead of time, but not these two. Anyway, my whole point of this story is one of the reasons that Andy and I were really drawn to the prophet that we're going to talk about today is because of this reason. Because plan A sometimes comes when you least expect it. Plan A sometimes comes when you're not ready for it. Plan A sometimes comes when you had everything in order and everything seemed to be going fine, and boom, God comes with the plan A and everything shakes up. And the prophet we're going to talk about today is one of my absolute favorite prophets in the Old Testament, and his name is Elisha. So much so that Andy and I really related to this story of Elisha that if Serenity had been a boy, her name would have been Elisha. But why were we so drawn to him? Because when God called Elisha, Elisha didn't hesitate at all. When God called Elisha into ministry, he didn't hesitate at all. He didn't make a pros and cons list. He didn't say, well, let me just keep things that I have. Let me keep my comfort things, and I'll give you part of my life, but I'm going to keep this part. He didn't say that. He burned the plow. He slaughtered his oxen, and he kissed plan B goodbye. And we're going to talk about what that means. But why did he do this? Because Elisha knew that when God becomes your plan A, you don't need another option. Elisha knew that God's plan A was going to be better than anything else. Whatever B through Z could have offered, Elisha knew that God's plan A was going to be the best thing for him. And this isn't just another story of, a farmer turned prophet. This is a challenge to anyone sitting on the fence wondering if God is really worth the risk. And so today in this message, I want to talk to those of you who are sitting here with a hesitant heart. Those of you that are a cautious believer. The one who is sensing God's call but is still clutching to the past. The one who is stuck in their own way of doing things. The one who sticks to an opinion or judgment instead of God's plan. The one who is sitting on the fence. Because God is calling you not to play it safe, but to dig in with ridiculous boldness. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What does it look like to have ridiculous boldness? But before we begin, who is Elisha? So Elisha was the son of a very, very wealthy farmer. And that's important to remember because he was the son of a wealthy farmer, he was going to inherit all of that. His life was set for the rest of his life. Elisha would go on, when we first meet him in 1 Kings chapter 19, he's behind a plow. He's working with 12 yoke of oxen. So in this day, having 12 meant that you were very well off. Having one meant you were pretty well off, but he had 12. So he was working day and night on these oxen, and this was his future. This is what he felt like his life was going to be. It was all laid out for him. It was given to him on a silver platter, if you wish. He knew that this is what he was going to do the rest of his life. But God called Elisha to become the successor of the prophet Elijah. Elisha would go on to perform more recorded miracles than any other Old Testament prophet. He doubled the number Elijah did, just as he requested in 2 Kings 2-9 when he asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. He tops the miracles and he tops the things that Elijah did, all because he said yes to God. But before Elisha ever preached a message or performed a miracle, he made a bold and costly decision. He burned his plow and followed God's call. Sometimes the boldest move of faith isn't stepping into something new, but leaving something behind. And that is very, very hard. Elisha's calling started when he burned his plow and cooked his oxen. We're going to talk about that. Eliminating his old life so he could walk into God's new life planned for him. This is the kind of faith that we're called to live out. Not cautious, not half-hearted, but bold faith. So I want to talk to you today about what bold faith, ridiculous boldness really looks like. And so we're going to look closely today at the word bold. So if you've got your Bibles, we're going to follow the story in 1 Kings starting in chapter 19, verse 21. And the B of the word bold that we're going to start with today is burn the plow. The Bible tells us, so Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. So to put this into perspective, so Elisha was out in his field working like normal on this day. We're going to call it a normal Tuesday. He was out in his field, and Elijah comes up behind him and throws a cloak over him, symbolizing that God is calling him into something greater. And Elisha doesn't really question anything. He simply goes and he burns his backup plan. So, at this point, he was pretty convinced that he was going to just be this farmer for the rest of his life. But here comes an opportunity that God calls him into something greater. And what does Elijah do? He burns everything. He burns his way back. So he burns all 12 oxen. He feeds it to everyone that was around. He burns all of his plows and his equipment and everything, goes up in flames, and he leaves and follows. And what does that represent? It means that Elisha burned his plan B. He couldn't go back. He couldn't go back because he gave everything away to follow when God said go. Bold faith eliminates a backup plan. When Elisha was called by God, he didn't keep his farming business just in case being a prophet didn't work out. He burned the plows, he slaughtered the oxen, and he fed the people. Why? Because when you know God's calling, plan B has to die so plan A can live. That's just the truth. We can't fully be in if we're still teetering in plan B. And Elisha knew this, so he burnt everything and he gave it all away. They had the biggest feast with 12 oxen that day. He burned everything and gave it all away. He didn't just leave his old life, he destroyed the path back to it. There was no turning back. You can imagine that his family was probably not real happy with the fact that he burnt their plows and burnt his inheritance and left. But Elisha knew to follow God, he had to be all in. He had to be all in. God's plan is always plan A, but we want badly to cling to plans B through Z before realizing that those plans are our plans. Those are our comfort zones. Those are our opinions. This isn't just about Elisha. It's about us too. As we walk with God through different seasons of life, bold faith still calls us to burn plows of comfort, of control, of past expectations. God is not calling us to coast. He's calling us to trust. So what does that look like now? It is far more than just leaving a job. Burning a plow means burning the way we've always done things. Burning the plow kills the mindset of we've always done it this way. Let's be honest. The way the church used to do things, or the way things used to happen in the past, or the way that we liked it 10 to 15 years, 20 years ago, that can become a safety net for us. It can really become a safety net. But a safety net is not a plan A. That's a plan B. But what if God is doing a new thing? Elisha teaches us that bold obedience means laying down the old tools so our hands are free to receive the new ones. We can't do new work with old tools. We have got to be willing to lay down this mindset of we've always done it this way. Burning the plow means laying down plan B and trusting God's plan A. For many of us, plan B looks like control, holding on to a position, preferences, or power, just in case things don't go how we think they should. But God's plan A is always better. It may not be predictable, but it's always purposeful. We can't predict it, but it always serves a purpose. The question is, will you trust him enough to lay down your own backup plan? Burning the plow requires burning the plow is retiring a title, not a calling. And that's a really big difference. When we step into a calling, no matter what that is, you can have a title at work that is still a calling, but it's living out the calling, not the title. And that is a very fine line, because the difference between living out a title and living out a calling is pride. And that's a hard reality and something that I have to keep in check a lot too. Maybe you've stepped away from leadership or teaching, but you haven't stepped away from the kingdom. There is still so much work to be done. You're still called to disciple and to mentor and to encourage and pray. Plan B says, I've done my time. Plan A says, I'm still on mission. Plan A says, this should be my way. Plan B says, this is God's way. Plan A says, I deserve this respect. Plan B says, I deserve this respect. Plan A says, God gets all the glory. It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with me. Sometimes I like to ask people, when we're looking at burning our plow, what would you be willing to give up if it meant your loved ones were sitting next to you in church? That's burning the plow. What would you be willing to give up to have your loved ones know Jesus? And that's a scary thing to do, because this is a much different world than what a lot of us were saved in a long time ago. But we have to be willing to burn the plow. Remember, you are never too old to be bold, and God is never done with us until we have our last breath. So what plow do you need to burn? What plan B is God asking you to lay down so you can step into his plan A? Burning the plow means closing the door to everything that keeps you from full obedience. It's saying, I won't live in my opinions. I won't live in my past. I'm all for what is next. That's what burning the plow means. The second point I want to make in our word bold today is the O, and it stands with obey without seeing. 1 Kings 19, verses 19 through 21 says, so Elijah went from there and found Elisha. Elijah threw his cloak over him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and my mother goodbye," he said, "and then I will come with you." And Elijah replies with, "Go back," he replies. "What have I done to you?" So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. Obedience means stepping out before the future is clear, trusting God's call even when you don't see the whole plan. Elisha was living a secure, comfortable life as a wealthy farmer. Then Elijah comes and calls him to follow God's mission. Elisha's response wasn't just to walk away quietly. He destroyed his means of livelihood, his backup plan, his security. He had no guarantee of what would happen next, no roadmap, just the promise of God's leading. This is obedience without seeing, a radical surrender of control, stepping out with trust even when the future is uncertain. But what does that look like? What does that mean to obey without seeing? It's saying yes to God's call on your life even when you don't know what the next step looks like. Start that new career, that new ministry, or move without having every detail figured out. That is what God is calling us to do. It's laying down our plans or preferences that might be holding you back from following God's call. Whether that's a ministry role or a relationship repair or even a new direction in life, God is calling you to obey without seeing the whole picture. God is calling us to release long-held opinions or traditions about how things should be done in our church and even in our families. Trust God's fresh work, even if it means letting go of that familiar control. It's giving up a secure job or a retirement plan to serve in ministry full-time, trusting that God will provide. It's letting go of a long-time church role or influence so younger leaders can step up. It's choosing forgiveness in a broken relationship without seeing immediate reconciliation. It's saying yes to God's leading to serve or move, even when the how or when isn't clear. I don't know about you, but it's really hard to take a step forward when you don't know what you're about to step into. It's really hard. But God is calling us to obey without knowing every single step, because that's what faith tells us to do. And that's what ridiculous faith calls us into. And the great thing about it is because God is the author of those steps, He's going to be there with you every step of the way. Even when things don't go well, even when it feels like you didn't make the right decision, God is there guiding every step. But He's asking you to take the first step of obedience and obeying without seeing. The L, and this is the one that I struggled with the most. You know, a couple weeks ago I told you that whenever Pastor Michael and I speak and God lays something on our hearts, usually it's also a convicting moment for us. This was a big one for me, and I almost took it out for that reason because it made me very uncomfortable. But this one is let go of control. Does anyone in here have a control issue? Anyone? I appreciate the honesty. Letting go of control. Bold faith means trusting God's timing and ways and not ours. And I was very convicted by this because I have a lot of opinions on how things should look and go. I have a lot of opinions on how things should be and what things should be tried and even with my own children, what things they should be doing. And I'm always right, so they should listen to me, was the bold statement that God said, no, let go of control. Bold faith means trusting God's timing and His ways and not ours. Elisha had to lead the kings and armies in an act of obedience that seemed absurd. Later on, and we're not going to get into this story very deeply, but later on, God asked Elisha to dig ditches in the middle of a drought with no forecast of rain. So God asks Elisha to go out and prepare for the rain, even though the rain had been gone for years. They were in the middle of one of the biggest droughts talked about in the Old Testament. Apparently I can't speak today either. And God asked Elisha, go out and prepare for the rain. No clouds in sight. No weatherman giving a forecast that rain was in sight. And yet Elisha obeys. And not only does he obey, but he leads an army of people to go out and dig this ditch to prepare for rain. He had to let go of the thought of, that doesn't make sense. Why would I do that when there's no rain in sight? And not only, again, does he do it, but he has to lead an army of people to follow and do the same thing. And then he digs the ditch, and it doesn't rain. It doesn't rain. For several days, it does not rain. So here he was obedient. He did exactly what God asked him to do. And he gets done building the ditch, and he says, okay, God, send the rain. And God doesn't send the rain. So Elisha has to let go of control and be obedient in the wait. And friends, that is hard. That is hard. He couldn't summon the water. He couldn't speed up the miracle. All he could do was make space for God to move. That's all he could do. Friends, the same thing happens when we relentlessly pray for our loved ones. I had a friend of mine whose granddaughter abandoned the entire family. And she didn't want to have anything to do with them. She didn't want to have anything to do with the family. She entered a relationship that was pretty abusive, and that person drugged her away from the rest of the family, and so she had no contact. And my friend Becky prayed twice a day, every day, for 6 years. And one day she got an invitation to a baby shower for this granddaughter. And Becky went. She called me right before and said, I don't know if this is a trap or not. And I said, that's in God's hands. This is what you've been praying for, go. She prayed twice a day, every day for 6 years. How many of you have prayed for something and after a week have given up? I do that all the time. All the time. But God is asking us to let go of control and know that He is responsible for the miracle, and He will bring the miracle, not in our timeline, though. And that is the thing that is so hard. Not in our way, but He will bring the miracle. We need to prepare for the rain. We need to prepare for the rain. That's the essence of letting go of control. Doing what God asks and trusting Him with the outcome. Letting go of control is not letting go of influence. It's shifting our mindset from enforcer to encourager. Instead of pushing things our way, we become a source of wisdom, encouragement, and prayer, supporting for those that are stepping up. We let younger leaders lead, even if they do it differently. Methods may change, but the mission remains the same. God's Spirit works through every single generation. The Apostle Paul writes at one point, do not let them judge you because you are young. All of us are young in the eyes of God. All of us can still be used. But we have to follow God's way. Trusting the Spirit is still working. God never retires. God never gets tired. God never forgets. That's sometimes really hard. God, did you forget me down here? Why is this so hard? I did what you asked me to do. Did you forget your part? God doesn't work like that. Just because your role changes doesn't mean your purpose ends. Just because the miracle doesn't happen right away doesn't mean that we can quit trusting. And just because God doesn't send the rain doesn't mean His plans have changed. It means we need to be obedient in the wait. The question is, are we willing to trust God with our legacy? Because control is comfortable, but that's not where faith grows. Elisha didn't know when or how the water would come, but he prepared and waited, and God was faithful. Letting go of control is not weakness. It's a radical trust that God is calling all of us to have. It's saying, God, I don't need to run the show. I just want to make room for your Spirit to move. When you let go of control, you open your hands to receive God's power and his peace. And the final lesson I think that we are learning in our boldness, our ridiculous boldness today, is do it anyway. Going back to 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 21, Elisha's immediate response to God's call was this. So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. Then he set out to follow Elijah and become his servant. Bold faith acts, even when it's costly, risky, or doesn't make total sense. That is what God is calling us to do. Elisha didn't hesitate. He didn't make excuses. He didn't wait until everything was neatly lined up. He burned the plow and did it anyway. It didn't make sense. He knew it was going to cost him a lot, but he did it anyway. That's what bold faith does. It takes the next step no matter how uncomfortable, uncertain, or even ridiculous it seems. And might I add, it takes the next step no matter what other people tell you. No matter what other people tell you. Because one of the ways that the evil one works is he's going to distract you from God's calling. He's going to distract you from God's plan. And even though he can't control anything, sometimes he can bring some people in to try, and even in good faith, convince you that God's way is not the right way because it doesn't make sense. Can you imagine when Elisha went and started burning his plow and his family came to the field and said, "What are you doing?" Or even when he started digging that ditch, "What are you doing?" Or this week I was really reminded of Noah, who built that ark in the middle of a desert. An ark that no one had seen. Can you imagine the neighbors, the people all around him that thought, what is he doing? And can you imagine the backlash he probably got when he said, God told me to do this. And here's the thing that's sad. We have a lot of people in this world that use the lines, God told me to do this, without really reading the word of God and knowing what it says. So it's really hard to follow God's calling in this fallen world. But God will be with you every step of the way. So even when you're not supported, you are supported by God, and God is calling you to do it anyway. Sometimes that means standing up for things that are not popular but right. Sometimes that means laying down some things that are comfortable. But God has something so much bigger planned for you. It doesn't matter your age. God doesn't care about age. It's all about our obedience. God is telling us to start those ministries that God has been stirring in our hearts. Don't wait until everything seems perfect. God is telling us to make that phone call, to reconcile that broken relationship, even if you're not sure how it will go. God is telling us to step up into new roles, even when we feel unqualified. One of the greatest things that we can see in the Bible is God often qualifies the unqualified. None of us are qualified to serve God, but God qualifies each and every one of us because that is what we are created to do. And God is telling us to step into boldness and to share our story, to share our testimony, even if we're afraid of being vulnerable, because you never know how your story could lead someone else to knowing who Jesus Christ really is. I think there's every single one of us in this room at some point has felt unloved by God. And God needs us to share with the world how we were unlovable, but God loved us anyway. We need to be bold in our stories. Bold faith isn't reckless, it's responsive. So, what's the thing God is calling you to do but you're hesitating? Do it anyway. Don't wait for the rain. Don't wait for perfect clarity. Don't wait for approval from others. If God said, dig the ditches, burn the plow, take the step, do it. Bold faith doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't need all the answers. It just says, God, you've called me, and I'll do it now. Bold faith doesn't wait for perfect clarity. It doesn't need approval from others. It says, God, if you've called me, I'll go. So let's burn the plows. Let's dig the ditches. Let's let go of control. And when fear creeps in, let's do it anyway. Because ridiculous boldness isn't for the few. It's for all of us who say yes to Jesus. You know that moment when Elisha burned his plow? It's so important to his story because it shows the depth of his commitment before he ever stepped into public ministry. And here's why that matters so much. It was the point of no return. Elisha didn't leave his old life. He destroyed the tools that would allow him to go back to that. By burning the plow and cooking the oxen, he made a bold statement of, I'm all in with God. No safety net, no second guessing, no plan B. This is crucial because many people say yes to God but keep their options open. Elisha's obedience was total. It marked a shift from security to surrender. Coming from wealth and stability, Elisha gave up a secure future, land, inheritance, and a predictable life for an unknown journey with a prophet often persecuted and hated. People knew who Elijah was at this point. Many people had no idea what he was talking about, and many people hated him. Multiple times there were threats on his life. And Elisha said, that doesn't matter. I will go because God called me to go. He chose calling over comfort. He chose God's way instead of his own comfort. And again, I want to remind you that that's not just a job. That is giving up our comfort so that we can do kingdom work. And that's hard. That's really, really hard. It set the tone for his entire ministry. Elisha would later speak bold words to kings, raise the dead, and multiply oil for widows. But none of those miracles would have happened if he hadn't first made a personal sacrifice. The burning of the plow was the fire that lit the rest of his story. If he wasn't willing to burn the plow, God couldn't use him in the mighty ways that God needed to use him. And Elisha in that moment said yes because he didn't want to miss out on what God's plan was. Here's the thing, God's plan will always unfold. God's plan will always unfold. But what I like to tell people is, wouldn't you rather you be a part of that? Wouldn't you rather you be a part of that? And it also reflects the principle of ridiculous boldness. At one point, Elisha begs God for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Elisha wasn't just asking for more miracles. He was asking for more of God. That kind of boldness only makes sense when it's built on the foundation of a radical surrender. So why is the plow burning moment so important? Because it proves that before God used Elisha publicly, Elisha trusted him privately. Before he could be God's voice, Elisha knew he had to be God's vessel. And that began with a fire in a field, a ridiculous, bold act of faith. But sometimes we find ourselves very, very stuck in a comfort zone, stuck in a fear, stuck in an opinion. Sometimes we have to give up some things in order for us to live plan A the way God intended. And that is so hard. Sometimes it's a job, sometimes it's a comfort, but friends, sometimes plan A means laying down our selfishness and the way things used to be. Sometimes we need to lay down our lives not only for God to use us for his plan A, but also so he can build his church. It may not be the way we want it, but is it really about us anyway? I think sometimes we need God to really search our opinions and the things that we complain about. I think sometimes we really need to search ourselves and to ask, are we really doing what is best for the kingdom today? Or are we living in the kingdom work of yesterday? God is calling us to live in the kingdom work of today. God is calling us to step into plan A, boldly knowing that it may not make sense. But you can never go wrong when we follow Jesus. So sometimes burning the plow is staying put. Sometimes it is. But that means we got to get rid of those backup plans. And that is what God is saying to us today. Why is Elisha my favorite? Because I know there are times in my life that I stayed stuck because burning the plow seemed too ridiculous. How many of you sitting in here today are in that same boat where burning the plow seems a little too bold? But God is not asking us to stand in safe faith. He's asking us to stand in bold faith.